Hello, welcome back to my channel. This is going to be another one of my PowerPoint videos where I spend 20 minutes putting a really scrappy slideshow together and basically just throw my thoughts at you. I really like doing this. Okay, I'll be honest. Time, ironically enough, given the book I'm about to talk about, is very short, right? I'm moving country in a month. I'm leaving my old job. I'm starting a new job. My two kids, as of today, are absolutely feral. Time is not on my side. So I quite enjoy doing these little PowerPoints that can talk about some books that I've been reading recently or some topics that are on my mind in a way that doesn't require a whole lot of editing and kind of behind the scenes legwork. So I hope you like them too. Today I want to talk about A Short Stay in Hell by Stephen L. Peck. Now, I've actually read this book twice this week, which sounds very impressive, but you'll know if you've seen this book on a shelf that it's very slight. It's very slim. It's only about 110 pages long. The audiobook, which is how I did it, was 2.5 hours. But it's also worth talking about. I haven't really decided what to call this, though. Is it a discussion? Is it a review? I've just put IDK. Because and the reason I'll get to this in a minute is it's really too difficult to talk about this book without getting into spoilers. So in some ways, I want to encourage you to read it. But at the same time, by talking about it, I'm sort of spoiling large parts of that. We'll get to it on the next slide. So hang on with me till the next slide, and I'll explain that more generally. But the long and short of it is, this is a really interesting book, even when it's not a good book. And I'm not sure I think it's a good book. It's still very interesting. You know, I've been reading a lot of these horror novelettes over the last year or two. So, for example, I read Tender is the Flesh last year. And this book is wildly different from Tender is the Flesh. Really, in terms of plot, they've got no crossover whatsoever. But they have that similar thing of you finish them, you put them down, and even when the plot's gone and the characters are gone, and even no quotation, no semblance of a quotation remains in your brain, the book itself will still hang on in there with you. And I really admire that about these texts I've been reading. When you get that central premise, it remains. It just remains. So I want to encourage people to read this book, but as I just said, spoilers are kind of going to be a thing here because the book is essentially just a playing out of its central premise. You get told what this premise is on the first page, and the following 109 pages just roll that out in front of you. So, and to be honest, I kind of think the title is a bit of a spoiler as well. Ideally, this book would just be completely blank and handed to you. That would probably give it the most punch. But from a marketing standpoint, that's probably impossible. So what I'm going to say is just, look, there are going to be unavoidable spoilers here. I'm not going to talk about certain scenes or certain characters on page 80 or 90. It's not going to be like that. Everything that I talk about is pretty much revealed on page 1, except for maybe 1 or 2 details. But at the same time, what you are told on page 1 is the book. So if you are very spoiler averse, I don't judge you for that. Go away, read it. It will probably take you as long as watching maybe 2 episodes of a TV show or a Star Wars movie, something like that. You will get through this book in no time whatsoever. Go for a bit of a walk and read A Short Stay in Hell by Stephen L. Peck, and I will see you on the other side. It is such a phenomenal little novel, even though I don't think it's phenomenal. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a minute. But again, the long and short is it's going to stay with you. It's worth picking up. So what is that? I should say premise. My face is in the way. Look, you can kind of imagine me just being the ISE. What is the premise of A Short Stay in Hell? Well, I invite you to imagine a library, which is what these 2 pictures are in front of you. There's very little fan art that I found for A Short Stay in Hell because the entire setting is a library. And this is taken from, I believe, Borges, a short story by Borges, or at least the idea by Borges. Inside this library, I invite you to imagine books on a shelf. Surprise. Every single book is about, I think it's 410 pages long, and inside each book is a unique combination of all the characters in the English language. So the letters, the numbers, the punctuation marks, every single possible combination of these elements is somewhere in this library. So it's very big, as you can imagine. So the vast majority of these books will contain something like XQ2493X-4. It'll just look like computer code. But very few books might have a sprinkling of what just coincidentally happens to be some kind of English. You know, you might be reading Q24X9 star 2465. Yeah, there'll be kind of sprinkling of just like, what could you call it? Organic English that just happens to fall on the page because it's entirely random. But because you have every single combination of letter in the English language inside this library, inside the books within this library, you will also find literally every single text ever written. You'll find every Stephen King book. You'll find every Herman Melville book. You will find an autobiography of Stephen King as told by Herman Melville, right? Whatever you can imagine that can fit inside 410 pages is somewhere in this library. This library is hell, or one hell. It turns out, at the start of this book, you're told Zoroastrianism happens to be true, so bad luck for everyone else. The main character, Soren, happens to be a good old Mormon boy, and he is cast into hell. He can get out of hell, though it's a short stay in hell. It's not infinite, and that's the key part here. It's from a time perspective, it's infinite, but he can escape at any time. All he has to do is find the book that tells him his life story back to him. Once he finds that particular book in this absolute sea of stories and non-intelligible books, he will be allowed to leave and enter paradise. That's all he has to do. It is a short stay in hell. However, as I've told you, so the picture here, it's a monkeys with a typewriter situation. If you're not aware, there's that famous line or kind of anecdote that if you leave a monkey alone with a typewriter in a room in an infinite amount of time, he will actually be able to type out, I believe it's the complete works of Shakespeare or Hamlet or something like that, just purely by having an infinite amount of time at his disposal. That is not a probability, that is a certainty. That's kind of what's going on here. It's the ultimate needle in the haystack, but the needle exists. The needle does exist. But here's what we get on page 1. And I'll read this to you. This is paragraphs 2, 3, 4, I believe. I suppose I must start at the beginning. A beginning so long ago that its horizon is a vanishing point at the convergence of two Euclidean lines that would be parallel by any human measure. The first years are the easiest to describe. They were years of adventure, companionship, and love. I have not seen anyone for uncountable years. We have all scattered far and wide into the vastness of this space, and now cannot find one another. I suspect by now we are all alone, yet I labour on. This is the slow horror of a short stay in hell. Yes, the pain is finite. It's not even pain, is it? The dreariness is finite. We do know that the character will eventually end up in heaven. That's not, again, a possibility. That is a certainty. But what this novel does brilliantly, and this is why I said it to you at the beginning, if you have any indication of wanting to read it and your spoiler reverse, go away. The whole novel is about the gradual horror as the narrator Soren realizes just how horrible this punishment is, right? Because if you think about it, if something is truly, truly infinite, well, this is kind of one way I've been thinking about it, at least. There's a certain kind of despair that comes with what you could maybe call infinite conventional hell. There is no escape. You will just be suffering forever. And maybe the Western Judeo-Christian traditional way that we kind of describe hell as infinite, there is a despair to that because it just goes on forever and ever and ever. This is a very different kind of horror. And in some ways, it almost feels worse, right? Because there's that tiny glimmer of hope. You know that even if it takes trillions and quadrillions of years, this character will eventually get out. And all he can do is cling to that certainty, despite the fact that he's going to spend hundreds of years walking down corridors, testing every single book for the billionth time, trying to, reach the very ends of the library to maybe start from afresh. Whatever he has to do, he will eventually win out. But it's what he has to do to get there that is what makes this novella so flippin' spectacular, to be honest. And again, I've said that I'm not fully sold on it, but this gradual creeping horror is what makes this piece absolutely excellent. And at the same time, the author does say straight up, you think this is bad. Imagine what, an infinite amount of hell is like. And there's truth to that too. We're just seeing it from a slightly different angle. So what I've said here is we move from food dispensers to absolute despair. Again, I'm trying not to spoil anything that isn't very apparent on page 1. At the very beginning, he says there's joy here. We're with other people. We're not in pain. We're just having to find this book. So it actually seems very chill. And there's kind of a comedic element at the beginning of the text as well that's there too. There are some jokes that are told at the beginning. And so that makes this slow creeping realization of how vast this library is, light years by light years. Such a bleak, desperate, slow, again, it's a slow realization, but at the same time, you're told from the very beginning. I've got no idea how to talk about this book. I don't know why I chose to make a PowerPoint on it. So what I've said here is this book handles existential crisis that comes from time beautifully. It's not that this hell is infinite. in a sense, but it also is the fact that this hell is infinite. Because again, if you sit and twiddle your thumbs and do nothing, you will be there for an infinite amount of time. It takes you standing up and actually doing this procedure to be able to leave it. So there's a few different elements here, kind of themes or kind of broad topics that the novel discusses that I wanted to very quickly touch on. So ennui and boredom is the biggest one. If you're stuck in a library for a billion years, in some ways it sounds quite cathartic for a little bit, but ultimately there is nothing else to do. And this is something that, again, is told on the first page, the crushing boredom of it all. You're basically just left with by yourself and these books for possibly millions, billions, trillions of years. And what that does to your mental state, are you the same person after that amount of time? In some sense, no. Maybe there's a sense that when you actually get to heaven, you've been so radically numbed by all that's come before, it doesn't really matter. You have relationship and social structures. This is a broader question in the novel. What extent can relationships withstand billions of years? And I don't think this is as bleak as maybe I've been describing so far. I really think this is an open question in the novella itself. And if you've read it, I'm curious if you agree with me or if you disagree with me, because the question as to which relationship in particular does hold up in the face of billions of years is something that's juggled, I would say, quite successfully and with a little bit of ambiguity compared to these other themes. The idea of personal identity is a big thing that comes up in this novel. If you've spent your whole life believing one thing and then you're told, surprise, you're wrong, that does shake you to your core. And as your time in the afterlife becomes near infinitely longer than your time on Earth, how do you change? Can you change? Or are you locked into those first 40, 50, 60 years that made up your mundane earthly existence? I don't know. And then obviously the big question in this novella is infinity. There's a line early on in the book. Infinity would be a better name for this than what this really is, because it feels infinite. And this is really the whole kind of crux of the premise. And again, the premise is the novel. It is just infinity, or it's not infinity, because infinity is literally endless, and this is by definition not endless. But the human brain can't really parse those two things. If I told you to go and walk to, what's the closest star? Proxima Centauri. If I told you to walk to Proxima Centauri, that's 4 light years away. That is basically an infinity, because humans cannot scale up that high. And this is one of the things that the novel handles really well. This sense of vast amounts of space being infinite. And it does mess with the reader's mind. It's not just something that goes on inside the character's point of view. It is something that you begin to go back and forth and juggle yourself. That's handled really deftly. And then this idea of responsibility as well. It's your agency that's going to get you out of hell. It might take a long amount of time, but you will get there in the end. But if you choose not to do that, you're just prolonging what is ultimately, in some ways, worse than fire and brimstone. And I don't know if you would agree with me on that. Ultimately, it comes down to the question of meaning. Can anything survive in the face of billions and trillions of years? As you find out again on page 1, hell has people, hell has beds, hell has coffee. But is that enough to keep humans together? Is that enough to keep social structure intact? Is it enough to keep identity intact? That is really the core of what this novella is trying to ask. Of course, I haven't put here, there's clear religion themes as well. Religion is something that's brought up a lot, but not as much as you might think, given the title. It's peppered throughout, but it's not the central core of the whole thing. At least for me, I didn't read this as some kind of religious indictment or criticism of religion, although that is baked in there. It's much more broad than that. So the question becomes, why have I said a couple of times now here that I'm not entirely sold on this novel? Well, and I'm not even sure I'm convinced by this thing myself here. The book feels slight. And it feels largely unfinished. And yeah, again, forgive the really awful joke there. But there is a sense to which there are questions brought up at the start of this novella that are not answered. There's a few different things that are said from the premise that there are mysteries laid down. One of my, this is a spoiler for a different novel, The Colorado Kid by Stephen King. Okay, skip the next 60 seconds if you don't want to hear the spoiler. I'll put some little thing in, I hope, or I'll put it in the timestamps. The Colorado Kid by Stephen King frustrates me to no end, because it sets up this premise of a whodunit. There's some murder mystery. And then the end of this novella is basically Stephen King going, well, I don't know who did it. We'll never know. And so all the characters walk away basically going, yeah, this is a bit of a mystery, isn't it? Bonkers decision. I love Stephen King. Don't have a clue what he was thinking there. Experimental, I guess. But this book does the same thing. It does set a few questions in motion that it never resolves. And none of the characters feel particularly fleshed out. The setting is supposed to be a bit boring, so we'll forgive it that. But there is sort of an incomplete element to the text. However, you could argue that is part of the point. Because as you find out on page 1, this character doesn't leave hell, right? He's still there at the start of the novella. And you know that because he's narrating it to you, that is where he's going to stay. So none of the questions that the novel bring up do ultimately get resolved. They're just sort of left floating in the air as the main character is still looking for his book. It's a very conscious decision, but it is one that maybe makes me think that there are certain elements in the text that could have been explored a little further. I don't mind the question being raised and then left unresolved, but it sort of feels like there's a couple of throwaway lines here, which I won't get into for spoiler's sake, that the author does bring up, and then sort of they never get brought back. And that did wind me up. And I wish that maybe we just had a little bit longer with this novella. And I think that is my core criticism here, is that there are certain things that are not fleshed out. That key thing that it's trying to do, it does perfectly, but there are certain things that are raised that are just sort of forgotten about. So that, I would say, my big thing, my big critique, my big central, not even flaw, but just quibble with the novel would be that. So, but ultimately my question is, should you read it? As One Book from Hell says, very good, right, okay. But as another one says, I won't actually read this out to you. It's basically just what I've been articulating to you so far. It is worth reading, even though I do think it wears its themes on its sleeve. And I would say that is my second criticism, right? It's not the most subtle of novellas. It tells you exactly what it's trying to get across to you. I don't think there's much to annotate here, which is kind of weird because I think Stephen Peck is a philosopher. So you'd think there'd be a lot of depth and annotation possible here, but he doesn't really go down that route. It is very straightforward in its prose and its messaging, or maybe the raising of its themes will hit you over the head as hard as it can. But at the same time, that premise, again, that it borrows from somewhere else, is just so good. And the exploration and the bearing out of that premise through the eyes of a character is enough. Even though I've now explained to you what the novella is enough, having that experience yourself is enough for me to recommend it to you. So I've said, look, I don't know. It's kind of bleak. I'm off to have a biscuit and a lie down. Would I buy this for someone? Yes, I think I would. Not everyone. It's not going to go in many stockings this Christmas. Merry Christmas. Here's a little pamphlet on hell. But it is worth the thought experiment, and the thought experiment born out into a fictionalized little story. So that's what I had to say about A Short Stay in Hell. I hope it's now going on midnight on this Friday. I hope this is somewhat coherent. I hope you enjoyed maybe learning about a book you haven't read before, or if you have read it, let me know how you found it. When I go on Goodreads, it seems like the vast majority of reviews are 5 stars. I personally wouldn't go that high. I think the premise is 5 stars, but the actual story itself is a little bit lower. Let me know what you think. Let me know how you find these slightly more conversational, lecture-y style PowerPoints. I enjoy making them, certainly, and they're very easy to kind of pull together when I don't have time on my hands. So I think my plan going forward is whenever there's not enough time to put a quote-unquote proper video together, this is what I will be doing. So in the meantime, thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Goodbye.